Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Apologies for the abominable weather which has reduced our numbers, I suspect, a little bit from what the distinction of the occasion would otherwise ensure. But here we all are, and as Chancellor of the Australian National University, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this 2010 Narayanan oration, the 14th in the series. This annual lecture, as you'll know, is organised by the Australia South Asia Research Centre in the College of Asia and Pacific here at ANU. The centre very ably led by Professor Benjamin Jha. And this lecture is a very important fixture in the annual ANU Public Lecture series, or a group of such lectures. My goodness, must have been a break in the weather. People are coming in droves. Wonderful. This lecture honours, of course, His Excellency, the late Dr. KR Narayanan, past President of India. Dr. Narayanan actually inaugurated ASAC, Australia South Asia Research Centre, in 1994 and maintained a very active interest in its work. I have to say that I had the pleasure of meeting Sri Narayanan on several occasions myself in my capacity as Australia's Foreign Minister, and I share in abundance the respect and affection for this man which has been expressed by so many of the earlier lecturers in this series. His rise from very humble beginnings to the highest position in the land was an extraordinary one, and a product of a really extraordinary personality, characterised not only by great erudition and great commitment to public service, but a very real, tangible warmth and humanity. Someone who had a deep understanding, deep commitment to common humanity of his people, that of the world, and also deep commitment to the role of public policy in advancing that humanity. He was particularly preoccupied, I know, had conversations with him on several occasions, about the human impact of science and technology. And I remember one conversation with him, as I think we were wandering around Circular Quay on the occasion of his visit to Australia. He was rather taken by the story I told him of my own experience of one little piece of impact of technology on one little corner of India. The story goes back to my own days as a student travelling by third-class train in India, as I did for about 3 months of my life in the late 60s and early 70s. And on this particular occasion, I was sitting on a pile of elderly luggage in a hot, sweaty compartment, absolutely crammed over full of people travelling somewhere in northern India, I think on the run from Jhansi across to Sanchi. When at one point, one stop along the way, a very elderly, blind beggar musician came into the compartment and started to sing. An incredibly haunting, melodic, wonderful voice. I had with me, back then in the late 60s, tape recorder, which was about the size of a telephone book, plastic, great lumpen thing, which I was recording the sounds of everywhere I went. Of course, I couldn't resist but record this man's wonderful voice. And when he finished singing and was handing around a little tin cup, appropriate response, I wound the tape back and played it. And as the voice came back over the tape, this man's face darkened with absolute rage, absolute indignation that someone else was occupying his particular pitch, occupying this train journey, which of course was his own. The fellow passengers calmed him down. He was ready to almost hit my tape recorder and explained what was going on. And so I played another track of what he'd been singing. And the most extraordinary sort of beatific smile came across his face, because this, of course, was the first time he had ever heard his own voice. And for the remaining 2 hours of that trip, and I remember as vividly as it was yesterday, every passenger in that compartment, probably 50, 60, 70, 80 people crammed in, participated in a kind of session, encouraging him to sing something, playing it back, singing something else, playing it back. And by the end of it all, you had a very bonded little group of humanity, and the guy clutching the tape as he went away to harbour, hopefully, the memory for the rest of his days. Well, I think it was just one of those things that probably could only happen in India, and I know that KR Narayanan was very touched by that particular story, as I was touched by my relationship with him on a number of occasions that I met him. And I'm delighted that we are having this oration now in his honour and in his memory. We have participating here tonight a really formidably distinguished cast of guests. They include His Excellency Major General Michael Jeffrey, former Governor General of Australia, Mrs. Jeffrey, Her Excellency, of course, Sujata Singh, the High Commissioner of India to Australia. I think 3 former Australian High Commissioners to India, Darren Gribble I haven't seen, but Rob Laurie I have, and John McCarthy, who is also, of course, currently Chair of the Australia-India Council. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Australia-India Council for its support of this event, and to welcome any other members of the Council who are attending here today. I'd also like to very specifically welcome Dr. Isha Judge Ahluwalia, who is the wife of our major guest here today, but very much a person in her own right, leading Indian economist, and we're absolutely delighted to have you with us. Now, our main guest, of course, it will be my pleasure to call to the lectern in just a moment, Mr Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission of India, member of the Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister. He's one of India's unquestionably most distinguished economists and policy makers, with a long and outstanding career in the Government of India, as well as in international organisations, both behind him and, I suspect, still very much ahead of him. His appointments at the level of Secretary in the Government of India include Finance Secretary, Secretary of the Department of Economic Affairs, and Special Secretary to the Prime Minister of India. He's held major economic policy positions in the International Monetary Fund, including Director of the Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF, and the World Bank, including as Chief Income Distribution Division and Deputy Division Chief of the Public Finance Division. And along with all of those posts, he's had an absolutely stellar record of contributions to economic policy literature at the very highest levels. And the topic of his oration, and we'll get to it in a moment, is India's prospects in a post-crisis world, and there frankly couldn't be anyone with whom we could listen with more rapt attention than Montek Singh Ahluwalia on that subject. But before I ask him to come to the platform, consistently with the tradition that's been established in these lectures, I have to ask High Commissioner Sujata Singh to come to deliver for us, if she would be kind enough to do so, a message from the President of India, Her Excellency Mrs. Pravita Patil. So, High Commissioner, would you please come to the lectern and read that message for us? Thank you.
It is my privilege to read out the message from President Pratibha Devi Singh Patil. I'm happy to learn that the Australia South Asia Research Centre is organising the 14th KR Narayanan oration on the theme India's Prospects in the Post-Crisis World at the Australian National University, Canberra on November 29, 2010. The Indian economy has weathered the global financial crisis of 2008-09 quite well. At a time when several other economies of the world have slowed down, India continues to register high rates of growth. This year, it is poised to continue its high growth trajectory. There is growing interest in the Indian economy and its development model. I have no doubt that the oration will go a long way towards addressing this interest, focusing on the challenges and the opportunities shaping the Indian economy and its growth and development in the years to come. I wish the event all success.
Now, without any further ceremony, might I ask Mr Montek Singh Ahluwalia to deliver the 2010 14th KR Narayanan oration.
Professor Gareth Evans, Chancellor of ANU, Major General Michael Jeffrey, former Governor General, and Mrs. Jeffrey, Her Excellency Mrs. Sujata Singh, High Commissioner of India, Professor Ross Garneau, many other friends who've been High Commissioners in India, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is a privilege for me to deliver the KR Narayanan oration at the university this year. I had the pleasure of knowing President Narayanan before he became President of India, and I have very warm memories of his kindness and gentleness of character, and also his insight into social problems. I first met him actually when he joined the government as Minister of State for Planning. When Mr. Rajiv Gandhi was Prime Minister, I happened to be a civil servant in his office. And knowing that Dr. Narayanan, President Narayanan, he wasn't President, and Minister Narayanan at that time, had just moved from a very distinguished civil service career as a diplomat, I took the liberty of asking him, how did he like the move from the job of a civil servant, a diplomat, to politics and planning? And you know, it was, I think, it exemplifies his wry, self-deprecating humor, that he looked at me and I remember what he said. He said, well, I'm here in the Planning Commission, but honestly, I feel more planned against than planning. I moved into the commission later on. I mean, I wondered at the time, was he referring to the stresses of being a planner or the stresses of being a politician? I imagine there was a bit of both over there. But I think the subject of this oration is very much something that would have been close to his heart. He was very, very concerned about whether India will be able to make the transition into a rapid growth economy, but a rapid growth economy that also ensured a degree of social justice. So if he were with us today, it would be very interesting to know what his judgments are. I think they'd be broadly favorable. Let me just begin by noting something that I think probably most of you know. Right now, we are building on what is an amazingly good record for the past several years. I mean, for 4 years before the crisis, the Indian economy averaged a growth rate of about 9%. Of course, it was hit by the crisis of 2008, 2009, and the growth rate dropped to about 6.7%. But then it recovered quite smartly to 7.4 in 2009, 2010, 8.5 this year, pretty good chance of getting back to 9% in 2010, 2011. So it not only grew rapidly at rates that would not have been thought feasible by many people a decade ago, but it's also shown resilience in the face of quite a humongous crisis in the global economy. It has become one of the favored destinations for foreign direct investment, and particularly in this decade, the expansion in the volume of foreign direct investment has been really quite remarkable, indicating the extent to which foreign investment perception, investor perceptions have changed. I mean, in 2000, 2001, total foreign investment in India was about $4 billion, and in 2009, 2010, that had increased to $37 billion. So that's another indication of how the economy has been seen globally. I think today most observers project continued growth in the next several years. It's somewhere between 8.5% and 9%. And what is more interesting is that these projections, if carried further forward, would definitely show that the Indian economy would become the third largest economy in the world after China at #1, and by then the USA at #2. Now, India would not be the third richest country, regrettably. It would still be only a middle-income economy. But in terms of the total size of the economy, therefore the size of the market, it would obviously be a much more significant player than it is today. Now, all of this is obviously a vindication of the economic reforms that were carried out beginning in 1991. Started earlier, but really intensified in 91. And I think we can take that pretty much for granted. The reforms were slow, and when they were carried out, there was a lot of impatience on the part of many observers that why is the Indian reform process so slow? And there are good reasons for that. The way democracy works in India, highly pluralistic country, highly participative system. And while we were very trained to put out this explanation, I have to admit that one wondered at times that, isn't this a bit too slow? So it is really rewarding to look back and find that although slow, it seems to have had a major impact. Now, these positive developments are obviously things that we are very happy about in India. I think they're also more relevant also for the region. I mean, this region as a whole is growing much better than in the rest of the world. And in India, that's accelerating in growth, contributes to a greater balance in the region, introduces a new autonomous pole of growth that would actually increase the potential prosperity of the region as a whole. And therefore, should be of interest not just to Indians, but to everybody else in the region, including Australia. Looking at that record, the real purpose of this oration is to look at the future. What exactly does this portend for the future? Now, from India's perspective, there's no doubt that it has changed the economic scene in India. It has created a new confidence. It has created, particularly among our younger people, a sort of sense that the global game is not necessarily biased or weighted against newcomers. It's very difficult to quantify what a sense of confidence means, but I think economists are familiar with the role of animal spirits in all kinds of decision making. And there's no doubt that the success that we've had, particularly in some sectors, but also more broad-based, has in fact created a can-do attitude amongst many Indians, including in business, but not only in business, and that has relevance for the future. It has led people to expect that we should now take off onto a fairly sustained high growth path. Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh has been speaking of India growing between 9 and 10%. We in the Planning Commission have been tasked by him to look at the 12th five-year plan, which would begin in the year 2012, to see whether the economy can be put on a 10% growth path, and that's actually what we're currently engaged in. So the key question for us in India is, of course, can India do it? And with appropriate acknowledgement, obviously the answer should be yes, we can. We're working hard at finding out whether the details would measure up to that optimism, and I want to share some of those thoughts with you. Now, in one sense, the target is not actually unreasonable, because what has been happening in India is a steady acceleration in growth. Growth rate in the 1990s was about 5.7%. If you look at the decade 2000 onwards, ending in the year 2009, 2010, then you've got a growth rate that averages 7.7%. So compared to the 90s, there's a 2 percentage point increase in the average growth rate, and this in a decade that saw a global crisis of exceptional magnitude. So the issue arises that what's the chance of jacking up another 2 percentage points in the next decade? It would be reasonable to assume that the expectation is not entirely unreasonable. But of course, the key issue here is you mustn't assume that you can project past performance mechanically. There are many cases where countries have done very well for 2 decades and suddenly slumped. The best example of that, I think, is Brazil, which between the 60s and the 70s grew at an average rate of 9%, for 20 years in other words, and then collapsed in the 1980s to 2%. For the next 2 decades, and in the current decade is doing better, but only at 4%. So history provides examples of countries that have fairly significant spurts of growth, and then the growth spurt dies out. So the issue that one must ask oneself, and this is what we're asking in as objective a way as possible, is what is the prospect that India will be able to avoid that deceleration? And I think the answer obviously is that we need to analyze, we need to answer this question by analyzing the factors that accounted for India's improved performance, and to make sure whether they're going to be still around. I mean, part of the problem in many other countries is either they started making humongous big mistakes, so there were policy mistakes made, or, and this is the second thing one has to look at, new challenges arise as a result of the growth process, but somehow policy remains fixed on the old challenges, and therefore the failure to tackle the new challenges leads to the economy hitting a bit of a brick wall. So the issue really is the existing impetus going to be continued? Are there some new challenges that we might miss? And if not, what do we have to do to address those? And of course, it's very relevant in the post-crisis world to ask oneself, has the external environment changed in a manner that would make it difficult for India to achieve or to replicate the experience of the last 10 years? And these are the issues that I want to address in the course of the next half hour or so. But before I do that, I want to emphasize that, you know, a lot of the focus in India, or rather about India globally, is on the growth performance. This has become the basic metric by which certainly investors and stock market analysts, etc., look at growth, and they say, well, you're on a high growth path, you're not on a high growth path, etc. But from the point of view of the Indian government and any Indian planner, growth is not the only objective. A proper definition of our objectives really would be, A, of course, growth. For a poor country, it's impossible to achieve any kind of broad-based improvement in the standard of living unless you get a significant growth in GDP. But that growth has to be inclusive. I'm going to come to the definition of inclusive in a minute. It's got to be inclusive and it's got to be sustainable. You know, both inclusiveness and sustainability are ultimately issues of balancing. In the inclusiveness area, I think the most important thing to realize is that too much of the development literature defines inclusiveness as poverty reduction. Now, poverty reduction is extremely important, and in a way it is the sort of first objective, and we also emphasize that and have been doing for quite some time. But I think there is a new definition of inclusiveness that actually goes beyond poverty reduction, and that's particularly relevant for a society that is heterogeneous. It's regionally heterogeneous, it's heterogeneous in terms of language, it's heterogeneous in some way in terms of subculture, so people have different identities. And I think inclusiveness really, in a democracy which emphasizes participation, inclusiveness turns up as the demand of every group to actually have a piece of the action. That's not the same thing as poverty alleviation. It's perfectly possible to have a strategy that is extremely successful in alleviating poverty because it takes the poor and shoves them above the poverty line. But it does nothing to make the system truly inclusive, because today groups that may be traditionally viewed as being heavily concentrated below the poverty line, they're not just asking to be put above the poverty line. They want to have a piece of the whole action. So inclusiveness is difficult to define, it's multidimensional, it's just a way of running the system where everybody gets to, A, participate in the process. That's very important. There's a big difference between China and India, because in China, the objective is a harmonious society. That's an end result objective. In India, the objective is an inclusive society that is also very process-driven. Even if you achieve end results that are good, if it is not a process that's inclusive, you'll be seen to have failed in some way. And that's the logical consequence of running a democratic system. So inclusiveness is multidimensional, reduce poverty, reduce inequality across caste groups, satisfy regional aspiration, within regions ensure that some regions, some parts of the region don't become left behind. And that's becoming a new phenomenon in India, where states that are typically thought to be doing very well, experience the political pressure from within that, oh well, in Maharashtra, for example, it's only the coastal area that's doing well. What about the interior area? So it's all of these things have to be taken into account. And of course, cross-cutting themes across this also are relevant. One of the most important, obviously, is gender equality, which is constantly coming up as an objective in policy. The second, this is inclusiveness, the second issue is sustainability. Now, climate change has made sustainability even more dramatic, because sustainability now is a matter of justice between this generation and the next generation. You can't be, much of what we call GDP is supposed to be defined as value added, but if the value it destroys is not counted in GDP, and also if it's simply extracting value that it's not effectively replacing, it's showing in GDP what is actually a reduction in the inheritance of the next generation. So the idea is very much that you ought to have a growth of GDP in a manner that leaves the next generation with an inheritance no worse than what you started with. And if you do it that way, lots of issues come up. So these are the ways that we are trying to fix our objectives. Typically, you get definitions of conflicts, trade-offs. Is there a trade-off between growth and inclusiveness? Is there a trade-off between growth and sustainability? But I think there are also possibilities of synergy. I mean, there's a lot of growth-promoting policies that are based on inclusive growth, so the two actually reinforce each other, and much the same can be said about sustainability also. So having laid out that background, let me now turn to the question, why do I think India will be able to accelerate growth from something like 7.7%, which is the growth rate achieved in the decade that's just ending, increase it by, say, 2 percentage points to an average of 9.7% in the next decade? Well, I think we ought to look at this question in terms of the determinants of growth, A, on the supply side, and B, on the demand side. On the supply side, the focus has to be, in terms of the traditional growth accounting that most economists do, focus has to be what's happening to the growth of capital, because that's something that contributes to GDP growth. What's happening to the growth of labor, adjusted for labor quality, because that contributes also to growth. And what's happening to total factor productivity, because that also contributes hugely to growth. So these are the three elements that one needs to look at on the supply side. But you know, supply side growth accounting only tells you what is the growth potential, or the growth of potential output. You also have to ask the question that, assuming you have the supply side capability, is there the demand to sustain the supply? And a lot of the current discussion on the post-crisis world, etc., really focuses on that. Could it be that in the post-crisis world, there is going to be a change in the nature of demand, which may make it difficult for developing countries to actually achieve growth rates which, on the supply side, they're actually capable of sustaining? I think that the Indian story is actually quite good on all these points, and so let me briefly touch on each of them. First is obviously capital. Now, capital inputs into an economy actually depend on investment. And one can say that investment depends on domestic savings. In India's case, that's the dominant source of financing investment. They also depend on the supply of foreign capital. So if there's more foreign capital, you can have more investment. But resources are not everything. Investment also depends upon a vibrant entrepreneurial class. You can have a lot of resources, but for some reason, if the entrepreneurial class doesn't actually believe that any of this investment is worthwhile, investment won't happen. And that is, after all, what is happening currently in the US, where you frequently hear that corporations are sitting on $2 trillion or $3 trillion of liquid resources, but because of uncertainty, they're not investing. So how do we stack up on these three dimensions? The potential for the growth of capital, the potential for the growth of labor, and the potential for factor productivity growth. Well, as I said, on capital, I think all the three determinants, that is savings, supply of foreign capital, and the dynamic entrepreneurial class, are extremely positive. Actually, on the savings front, what we have is a situation If you really want to compare the next decade with the previous decade, then what you need to do is see what's happening in the decade. And if, for example, investment rates are rising, then the investment rate today is already higher than the average investment rate of the previous 10 years. So if the average growth rate of the previous 10 years is linked to the average investment rate of the previous 10 years, then the investment rate today is actually higher than that average anyway. And if you can assume some continued growth in that, some continued dynamic in that particular parameter, one can come to the conclusion that India is well positioned to have an investment rate in the next 10 years that will be significantly higher than the investment rate in the previous 10 years. And I've done some calculations, but essentially working from the domestic savings side, the numbers come out like this. In the beginning of the year 2001, the beginning of the decade that's just ended, the domestic savings rate in India was 23.7%. The impact of economic reforms, rapid growth, probably also the demographic transition, etc., led to a savings rate in 2007-2008 of about 36.4%. This came down because of the crisis, and I expect that when the figures for the current year come, it will have gone up again. So it would be reasonable to conclude that the savings rate in India in the previous decade, on average, was 31%, and we probably end the decade with a savings rate of 34%. So the real issue is how much can this increase over the next decade? And if 34% or say 35%, because we actually achieved even 36% in 2007-2008, so if 35% goes up by another 2 or 3 percentage points to take the savings rate to something of the order of 38%, then and the average during this decade becomes something of the order of 36% or 37%, then the additional savings in the next decade would be whatever it is, 36 minus 31, that's an additional savings input, approximately 5% of GDP. Combine this with what's happening on foreign capital. Because on foreign capital, in the previous 10 years, probably the average inflow of foreign capital, which didn't go into the reserves, was about 1% of GDP. It's our view that in the next 10 years, since the Indian economy is now much more open, many more people are investing in it, we could in fact see a foreign investment inflow of about 3% of GDP. In effect, the current account deficit would be 3% of GDP, a little more than what we've traditionally thought to be comfortable. 2.5% is what we've traditionally thought to be comfortable. But in our view, there's been a fundamental change in the global economy. If the industrialized world is going to grow slowly, and I think most people do not deny that, and if there's very high growth prospects in many emerging market countries, including India, then it would be logical that a lot more of investable resources would move from the slower growing part of the world to the faster growing part of the world. And in that process, for a savings, for a foreign resource flow to increase from 1% of GDP to 3% of GDP is not really too much. So that basically gives you an increase, a potential increase in the investment rate of 5% on the savings front, 2% on the foreign direct investment front, a total increase in investment of almost 7%. And it is not impossible to think that that kind of increase would be consistent with adding a 2 percentage point to the GDP. And that doesn't even count the contribution of labor or the contribution of total factor productivity. Now, as far as labor is concerned, India has a natural advantage at present, which is simply the demographic transition. We still have a young population, which can be a huge problem in the sense that we will see till about 2050 almost, the working age population in India will be increasing, whereas in all industrialized countries, including the United States, it'll be going down. And in China, it's beginning to go down already. So India will be the only major, well, large economy, let's say, which will still have a growing workforce. Now, a growing workforce is only an advantage if it takes place in an environment where a lot of investment is taking place, and also if the education and skill development parameter system is actually giving these people the kind of skills needed to ensure employability. And that is one of the major objectives of the government at present. Huge emphasis in using public resources and in using policy to leverage private resources to go into higher education and into skill development. Actually, skill development almost as if not more important than higher education. I mean, higher education is what attracts all the high-end attention. It's very important. But we need a phenomenal growth in middle-level skills for which we need to put in place skill development systems and institutions which I think have been neglected in the past. So a very important indicator of whether the Indian economy is reaching full potential will be what it's able to do on the skill side to take care of the improvement in labor quality. That brings me to the last point about the future growth, and that is really total factor productivity. You know, as people who are doing economics in ANU know that virtually every attempt to examine what has happened, what determines growth, etc., the answer is always look for the total factor productivity. Don't get too concerned about capital and labor inputs. Of course, capital and labor inputs are important. I mean, you can't have growth, high growth, without a growth in capital and labor inputs. But you can have a lot of growth in capital and labor inputs without getting much growth if the productivity side isn't looked after. And there's been a lot of work in India. Isha did some in the period when our total factor productivity growth was very low or negative, and those were the days when investment was taking place and we weren't getting growth. More recent work shows that during the economic reforms, there has been a change in that, and total factor productivity growth has become more positive. So the issue really is it the case that the economic reforms contributed to this turnaround in the generation of total factor productivity growth? Will that continue? And could that actually be intensified in future? Well, I don't know about the intensified, but there's no question that it will continue. I think one thing we've learned from the economic reforms is that the reforms work and they generate high growth. When the reforms were first introduced, there was a lot of doubt and uncertainty, and people generally said these reforms will ruin the economy, they will damage growth, and also they'll be bad for the poor. There has been a sea change in that perception, in the sense that nobody now doubts that the reforms help grow. They still doubt whether they're helping the poor enough. So that's a legitimate issue, and that's the issue of inclusiveness. The perception that people concede that the reformers know how to get growth. They're not all that sure that the reformers know how to get growth that is inclusive. That remains an important challenge that we must face. But I don't think anyone has any doubt that these reforms are generating growth, and I think that progress in these reforms will therefore continue, but in the gradualist way in which it has happened in the past. Now, this gradualism is directly linked, in my view, to the nature of Indian democracy, its highly participative nature, and also the fragmented nature of an electoral verdict most of the times. One good thing is that in India we've now seen many changes of government, and certainly at the central government level, governments have changed, and when parties that vilified the previous party took over, they didn't actually change the direction of reforms. It sort of continued. So I think it's one of those cases where the democratic process is inherently adversarial. And I think people have begun to realize that. That when politics is played out, it's the job of the opposition to criticize the government. It is not the job of the opposition to make a responsible judgment on whether what the government is saying is good or not good. In fact, quietly they probably do whatever they can to alter the political equation, but telling everybody that don't worry, we'll carry on doing the same things if these policies are good. And that's not a bad way of operating. What it does mean, what it does ensure, is that these reforms are there to stay. And the same thing is true in state governments. Actually, in state governments, we have frequent changes of government, and I would say that the politics of India, if anything, in the last 10 years, seems to be demonstrating that it's possible to win an election if you can demonstrate that you had a good performance on the development front. 10 years ago, the conventional wisdom was that the Indian voter believed that democracy was essentially anti-incumbent, sort of throw the rascals out type of policy. That's not what has happened in the last 10 years. I mean, governments that have been seen to deliver have got re-elected. And that's true not only of governments belonging to the ruling party, but also other governments. So I think there is a maturation process which pretty much ensures that the reforms we've seen will continue. And there is a huge agenda of reforms yet to be done. They're well known, they're out in the public. There's the issue, there's the obvious point that there's room for further opening up on the trade front. And we've been very successful, I think, in moving from a very closed economy to a reasonably open economy. But I think we could take more steps. And you see that in the willingness with which the central government has been entering into free trade agreements in East Asia. The Look East policy was an explicit policy aimed at integrating the Indian economy into the East Asian region. And that has been reflected in FTAs, free trade agreements that have been, we don't always call them free trade agreements, sometimes we call them comprehensive economic cooperation agreements, into which is built in a lot of free trade. And that is because these are felt to be perhaps politically less annoying than free trade agreements. But we have signed them with ASEAN, we've signed them with Malaysia, we've signed one with Thailand, we've signed one with Korea, we're virtually on the verge of signing one with Japan. Now this is a very different India from the India that one thought about 10 or 15 years ago. And building into that psyche is a changed attitude on the part of entrepreneurs. They're willing to accept this. They're investing abroad. They're going global. And so I think the agenda of continuing on trade reform will play out. There is the issue of extending domestic liberalization in many areas where it has not yet reached. Mining, for example, is a good one. And I think that also will happen. There's room to liberalize foreign direct investment in many areas where there are some limitations. Insurance is one, retail is another. All these things are being discussed in India. There's the issue of labor market reform. That is, in some ways, the most difficult because it's sort of flagged, as I recall, mainly by economists. And I mean, I think the economists are right, and I say this at home also. But I think it is getting to be recognized that what we need is a saleable package, which at the same time as introducing labor flexibility, increases the protection of labor in terms of standards of work and safety and things of that kind. So potentially even that could happen. And of course there's a whole slew of reforms in the infrastructure area, which is a relatively recent initiative. It's still a work in progress. We're bringing in the private sector wherever we can in order to put in more infrastructure. You know, I talked earlier about capital. That's a very aggregative concept. I think in India, what we need is a shift in the investment, in those parts of investment that government can direct, should shift into areas like education, areas like health, and of course areas like infrastructure. And there, I don't see any real opposition. It's just that things move a little slowly, but they do move. And of course, finally, on the fiscal side, we do have a commitment to reduce the fiscal deficit. There is there's a program underway to put in place a goods and services tax. This has got delayed because of, again, political negotiation with the state governments. But I'm very certain that this will actually happen. And when it happens, it'll have a huge impact. In fact, it would have a bigger impact than any of the other reforms, or any two of the other reforms. I think it's very important to realize that, you know, when people look at the reform agenda, it tends to be list-driven. When everybody has a list of reforms, and it's about checking them off, so have you done this, have you done that, etc. I think you need to take a view, is the broad agenda moving forward? It's virtually impossible for me at this point actually to tell which of these things is likely to move in the next year. But I'm pretty sure that some will. So I think that's the nature of reforms. And as long as that happens, I think it's reasonable to assume that the Indian economy will do quite well. Now, that's on the supply side. I want to just say a few things on the demand side, because you could have a situation where on the supply side, you build up the capability to have rapid growth. But on the demand side, you're not able to support the demand. Now, obviously, in the post-crisis world, there isn't going to be very strong export demand. In some ways, I think India is a little more favorably placed than other countries to cope with that situation. It is a problem. I think the notion that we are not export dependent, therefore it doesn't matter, is quite wrong. Because actually we've become more export dependent than we used to be. I mean, where our exports of goods and services ratio to GDP used to be 13% or so 10 years ago, it's now about 20+%. So we have become more open. And I just don't think that exports can be expected to do terribly well. So what do we do on the demand side? My view is that our focus should be on trying to generate additional investment demand in infrastructure. So if we replace the demand that we lose on the export front by demand which comes in the form of investment in infrastructure, this will be more import intensive, so imports will rise. There'll be less exports, and therefore the current account deficit will rise. This is actually happening. I mean, 3 years ago, we had near balance on the current account. Today, the current account deficit will be a little below 3%. So crucial to the viability of this mechanism is the ability to finance a 3% deficit of GDP. In my view, that is possible simply because India is underinvested in. I mean, you look at the pools of capital around the world and where they're invested and where they're underinvested, I think most people would concede that the percentage of available resources for the rest of the world invested in India is much less than what it should be given the size of the Indian economy, its openness, and the prospects for growth. So if we have a global economy that looks well managed, we don't have another black swan event, all the things that the G20 is supposed to do, which is to create a greater harmony amongst policies, etc., of major countries takes place, I think India should be able to attract that kind of long-term capital flow. And therefore, both on the supply side and on the demand side, it can be argued that the underlying realities are consistent with India's growth accelerating. Now, I said 2%, I mean, those are rough numbers. We're currently working on the 12th plan and we have a precise estimate. But of that order of magnitude, I think it can be argued. Now let me turn to the last part of my lecture, which is the listing difficulties. Because I mean, so far what I've said is that the existing momentum can continue, that the worsening of the global economy is not something that will derail the Indian economy, with a little bit of fine-tuning on aggregate demand and a little bit of fine-tuning on getting more capital in. But what about new challenges which will be thrown out by the growth process? Because many countries that have got derailed from high growth have got derailed because they underestimated the extent to which, when you get past a certain stage of development, altogether new challenges arise. Now, I made a list of about 5 challenges, and obviously I don't have enough time to discuss them all, but I will just touch on each of them, simply to show you that these are issues that are at the heart of the work that we're trying to do in the 12th plan. The first of these is clearly energy. I mean, no growth is possible without putting a huge demand on energy. Energy, water management, urbanization, climate change, and regional balance. In many ways, these are actually interconnected. I mean, what you do to manage the energy situation helps enormously in managing the climate change situation. How you manage urbanization, issues of energy efficiency of buildings, issue of energy efficiency of urban transport, directly helps both energy security on the one hand, also helps to do a little bit of mitigation on the climate change side. So what are the big challenges? Well, in the case of energy, clearly we need more energy. The limitations, the global supply of energy is going to become scarce. If it's really true that emerging market countries are going to go into a high growth mode, then the total demand will be put on the system's energy resources very large. You need to economize on energy. You need to do whatever is necessary to get more energy efficiency. And I think many emerging markets have done less than is possible in this area. We're very aware of this, and we have in fact outlined national plans for energy efficiency, which include laying down new standards for energy efficiency, taking another look at energy pricing to rationalize energy pricing, taking a look at expanding energy supplies, particularly to get out of carbon. I think the emphasis we are putting on nuclear energy, for example, is an example of looking for ways that will enable us to meet the energy requirements of growth without, in fact, polluting the planet. And the prospects of doing that are very good, in our view. There's the effort to look at completely new and renewable sources, like, for example, solar energy. It's small at the moment, but we have a national solar energy development plan, which is basically aiming at getting into the act in the belief that if many, many other countries do it, then the technology change that will be brought about through this process will make this particular source of energy a lot more efficient. And of course, there's a whole combination of just efficiency-inducing changes related to the use of energy. That's very much on the agenda and will be a key element in the 12th plan. The next major challenge is water. In many ways, I believe that the water challenge, the water crisis, is actually more serious than the energy crisis. And the reason for that is we don't have really the nuclear energy equivalent for water. There's just that much water, and population is growing, and what is more, we hope the GDP is going to grow. So if GDP is going to double in 7 years, and the water resources are going to remain the same, and climate change over the next few decades may make them more unreliable, some humongous change in the efficiency of water use has to be brought about. Now the good news is that currently water is extremely inefficiently used. I mean, 80% of India's water, and this is true for many countries, not just an India phenomenon, 80% of the water we use is actually used for agriculture. And it's widely believed that with better water management practices, we could cut the water use in agriculture by 50%. So it will immediately liberate 40% of the total water from agriculture. Now that's, these aggregate kind of numbers are a little misleading. What you need is a water balance that is watershed specific, because there's no point having a surplus in one place and crediting it to a deficit in another place. Every now and then people talk of interlinking rivers and so on. That is much more of a pipe dream than people think, because it's very complicated. So you need a region-specific strategy. And one of the biggest problems with water, unlike energy, in energy, most people think it's fair that you have to pay for energy. Unfortunately, in water, most people do not think it's fair that you have to pay for water. And you're faced with the economist problem that, on the one hand, you say water is scarce, we must conserve every drop. But nobody is willing to price water to reflect that scarcity. And that's, again, not just an Indian problem, it's a problem around the world. So how do we handle that? I think it's going to require some very deep thinking, including actually legal, legislative, institutional changes. How do we manage our water resources? We could probably take a leaf out of Australia's book, because the Murray-Darling River Basin shows many of the problems that we are facing. And there are other countries that have faced similar problems. The United States has these problems with water use. So that's the second big area and a huge challenge. The third big area is, of course, climate change. We have, a real solution to climate change is only going to happen when there is a global agreement. For the simple reason that whatever we do to mitigate climate change doesn't actually just help us. It helps everybody. And therefore, you need a global agreement on how much mitigation to do. I'm not going to go into that issue, but I think it's fairly well known that the world is not doing as well in that area as it should. But we are getting out of this perception that if the world isn't doing something, then we don't have to do anything. I think the big change in India in the last 2 years is that the government has introduced a national action plan for climate change, identifies mitigation, identifies adaptation, tries to do things that will actually, basically much of what I said on energy is relevant, move to non-polluting energy sources as much as possible. We have this year introduced a tax on carbon, 5% on coal, which is used to fund steps to encourage clean energy. I mean, that's the first time that the tax instrument has been used for that purpose. So there's a big agenda there, which we hope in the 12th plan we will be able to spell out. We have set a national target that we need to reduce the emissions intensity of GDP by 20% between 2005 and 2020. That's not a reduction in emissions levels, it's a reduction in the emissions intensity. But you know, even accepting that target was politically controversial. So a certain amount of effort had to be made to explain to people that while the world makes up its mind on how it's going to cooperate and in what manner, we should get into the business of doing something and setting our own targets. These are not binding commitments, but they are national targets, and I'm quite certain that we will actually be able to meet those. As a matter of fact, the hope should be that we would do even better, because certainly the world needs to do a lot better if you're going to avoid the catastrophic effects on climate change. And finally, just 2 words on regional balance. I think one of the things we've learned is that good experiences, good development experiences spread more easily within the country than they do from abroad. 10, 15 years ago, people would have identified certain states in the heartland of India, what used to be called the Bimaru states, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, UP, Rajasthan, Orissa, etc., as states that were just doing extremely poorly and were just not able to take off. And that was the period when people thought that liberalization was inherently geographically unfair. It would allow some states to forge ahead, whereas others would be held back. But I think both the data and perceptions have changed. There is a change in these states. Many of them more recently are experiencing higher growth. Interestingly, many of them are finding it very beneficial to have built infrastructure which increases connectivity. In Bihar, which has just had an election, at least if you go by newspapers, one of the major factors that led to the government, which is not a member of the ruling coalition, the government having done so well, is that the program of rural road connectivity was seen as a big success. So I think that there's lots that can be done through the extension of infrastructure that would increase the connectivity of our poorer states with the rest of the country and open up the possibility of these states also benefiting. Certainly the data show that the earlier characterization that these states are not benefiting at all is no longer true. Growth in these states is accelerating, and many of them have somehow been able to attract investment. So it's a matter of state policy. And one of the interesting things that has happened in India is that competition among the states has intensified. And many of our newspapers, or magazines rather, regularly conduct sort of competitiveness surveys where they rank states, and the relevant chief ministers turn up in New Delhi to receive awards from the relevant, well, it's all private activity. The Planning Commission does not rank states, by the way. It would be politically very difficult to do. But it's happening. And I think that is creating a perception that if you're not doing well, it's more likely to be your own fault than the fault of somebody else. So that is an overview, both macro, micro, and a little bit anecdotal. But all of this, to my mind, adds up to a picture that if India grew at 7.7% this decade, there's no reason to believe that it won't do better in the next decade, and a lot of reasons to think that it actually might. So, with those words, let me thank you for inviting me to deliver this oration. I hope
Well, thank you, Mr. Ahluwalia, for a very stimulating and informative lecture, which has been so comprehensive and systematic in its addressing of the issues. I suspect it's disarmed quite a few of the potential questioners among us, but we still have 20 minutes to show our form in this respect, and I hope you won't hold back. Let me not hold back for start. I just ask you one question. In the light of a very tough article in this week's Economist about corruption in India, putting some very high numbers on it, would you identify that as one of the challenges in your long list? Is it something of merely micro-irritation, or is it something of potentially macro-significance, particularly its impact on infrastructure projects?
Yeah. No, there's no question that, corruption is a problem. The only thing I would say with great humility is that it's not only a problem in India. There's a lot of corruption everywhere. The difference is that we probably have, we have a very free press, but I think the strategy of the press is to sort of produce allegations of wrongdoing, vaguely hinting at corruption virtually every day. So it is a problem. I think the government has recognized that, and I would say the surprise actually in some ways is that, old forms of corruption have actually disappeared. I'm not referring to petty bribes that people might have to pay, sort of grease money. But 20 years ago, the corruption was around getting industrial licensing, getting import licenses, getting foreign exchange permit. All of that has just more or less disappeared. I think there is a deep concern in India, and this is something we have to address. I sort of bundled it into infrastructure reforms, and I did talk about mining. I think the land market in India and how the land market functions is one of the most opaque things you can think of. And my own view is that in the next plan period, there needs to be much greater transparency in the nature of these transactions. And there are two sets of transactions. One is, when you get land for development, it ought to be extremely transparent what you're going to be using the money for, rather what you're going to be using the land for. And it ought to be a competitive process where those who own the land should feel that they got the best deal possible from a competitive set of offers. And that doesn't hold at the moment. The second set of issues really relates to the exploitation of mineral resources. Now here, this is not so much corruption as a suggestion of crony capitalism. That the issue of mining leases is very non-transparent. As a result, insiders are much more likely to get a mining lease than somebody who transparently wants to bid for it. And these issues have been recognized in the system. Right now, there is a there's an amendment to the Mines and Minerals legislation being considered. It's not yet gone to cabinet, it's being looked at by a group of ministers, principally in order to bring about greater transparency. So I think corruption associated with land transactions is a big issue. I mentioned urbanization as one of our challenges, but I think one of the major governance changes that will be necessary in order to bring about the urbanization that is bound to take place, one of the major governance challenges will be how do you clean up this side of the operation. I mean, very roughly, today about 300 million people live in what we call urban areas. It is said that by 2030 or 2035, this may double. So if 300 million is going to go to 600 million, there are estimates being made of how much resources have to go into creating the urban infrastructure that will accommodate this population. And this accommodation will have to be at what are then prevailing standards in terms of per capita income. Because if income is growing rapidly, countries are becoming richer. The idea that we'll be able to do all this investment and not clean up the land market is simply not sustainable. And I think if we do that, 75% of what is visibly seen to be corruption will have been taken care of. Now the problem here is there's not much the central government can do. All of this is in the realm of state governments. So we have to have a big educational task. We have to persuade the state governments that there's no way that they're going to be able to achieve this without taking some action. But you know, I don't lose heart on this because it's a very focused issue. Again, I think what will happen is that there'll be resistances in some states, but some states will take the lead. And when they take the lead, there will be a humongous rush of investment to the first set of states that we are there. And then I think pressure will build up. I mean, after all, in the 1980s, many people said it's impossible to do liberalization because there are too many vested interests. But if we did do liberalization, hopefully something similar will happen.
Okay, other questions? Yes, in the front row. Could you introduce yourselves, please, as you ask?
Yeah. Good evening, sir. My name is Deepak Gupta from Australian Business Council. As you mentioned in your speech, that India has changed in the last 10 to 15 years, and we all have seen. And there's a lot of strategic partnership that has been made, especially with Russia, United Kingdom, and USA. This is something missing between India and Australia at the moment, that we haven't come that close to a strategic partnership. And as you know, there's been a relationship now India is weighed by the menu, like we had a Clinton platter, Chelsea platter, and Obama platter recently. Are you going to see a Clark platter soon in India?
Well, I'm not, you know, when you say, what exactly is the nature of the thing that you wanted resolved?
The strategic partnership between India and Australia.
Yeah.
We have a lot of resources here, and as you said, there's an import capability in India.
Okay.
But still, we are missing that transformation from Australia to India.
No, I think, first of all, the strategic partnership was only launched last year, I think. So there's I think when the Prime Minister visited India, that's when they decided to launch a strategic partnership. I think it's true that in India, less energy has been devoted to strengthening the economic linkages with Australia than makes sense, given the fact that we're in a region that's rapidly growing. But I think one reason for that is that in the early stages of economic opening up, Indian business was focused very much on what's going on in Europe and what's going on in the United States. But I think they've done that now. There is a look east policy. This region, Australia, is very much a part of our conception of this region. And there are many things happening, like the East Asian Summit, etc., which will heighten the consciousness of Indians about Australia. Now, my impression is that although it's less than it should be, there is now a considerable increase in investments by Indians in some of the sectors in Australia in which you'd expect Indians to have a natural interest. I mean, there are Indian private sector companies that have bought coal mines in this country, are linking up, creating capacities to receive coal at the other end. LNG is another obvious area. The whole minerals area is an area where we could see a lot more cooperation. And between governments, I mean, the term, you know, strategic partnership is a framework. It's a signal that we want our businesses to interact more with each other. It's not, from an economic point of view, I mean, since we have no discriminatory rules about trading with each other, it's more a question of using the government's encouraging capacity to encourage to put businesses together. And I've been meeting with ministers today, and I mean, all of them felt that what we need to do as part of this strategic, to make the strategic partnership a reality, is to get Indian business and Australian business more often together. I mean, in all the other cases where this has happened, governments only facilitate. It's actually led by the private sector. So it's not that strategic partnership has a list of actions that the governments have to take. Of course, you know, there are areas where you could see a very sudden increase in trade. Export of uranium is one. I'm aware that there are restrictions on your side, and we accept that. So as and when you're ready, that would be, in my mind, a nice way of cementing the relation.
Mr. Ahluwalia, I'm Harpreet Chima from, I work for the SD government, a recent graduate of ANU and originally from Punjab. My question is regarding that you spoke about the supply side and the labor and the scaling up of increasing working age population. You can scale up. I mean, there's a lots of good educational institutions in India, but most of the people, as soon as they graduate, they leave and they go to to other countries. So, you know, I mean, you're obviously an exception, but most of the cream of Indian skills is the brain drain issue. My question is, what are you going to address that in your 12th plan? Is that something that you guys think about as well?
Well, I don't really think I agree with the proposition that most of the people, as soon as they graduate, go off to other countries. It is true that many people, when they graduate, go to study abroad. That's sort of not an unnatural thing. I mean, you know, you graduate from the IIT, you want to go to MIT to study. I think in earlier days, that became a permanent move. My guess is that in the last 10 years or so, people have gone abroad and come back. And frankly, from India's point of view, there's nothing wrong with people going abroad to further their studies. There's nothing wrong with people actually working abroad to gain some experience. But I meet many people now who see the opportunity in India. And we're seeing people come back. We're seeing people who are based there but investing, setting up units in India, devoting some of their time to India. So I don't think our strategy is to hold people back. I think the strategy should be to make India a more competitive place to be in. And I think that's actually working, because it's true that salaries abroad are much higher. But I'm not sure that that always translates into a feeling of satisfaction. We're hoping to persuade them that come back and be a part of the action. I mean, after all, if India is going to grow at 9%, and anybody who's 30 years old today would be well advised to pull up anchor and go home and do something about it, because there's a lot of opportunity.
Ross, did you have a question?
Yes, Montek, you mentioned, you contrasted the demographic transition that China's going through with the Indian demographic situation. China's labour force has begun to decline, and next decade will decline quite rapidly. Real wages have started to rise very rapidly. China's passed what Arthur Lewis called the turning point in economic development. How will that change India's opportunities in the international community?
Yeah, you know, I don't want to make it look as if the fact that China is seeing a decline is in some sense as a criticism. I mean, that's just there. I mean, we will also have a demographic decline. Many of us would have felt that if population policy had worked differently, the demographic decline would have been more in evidence, and it's the total effect that one is looking at. But I think what it does mean is that if you think of the world 20 years from now, and you think of India not only having people, but being able to skill them properly. I mean, it's really no use at all having unskilled people. But if we succeed in the job of skilling, and I think experience shows that India knows how to run educational institutions, at least up to and including the undergraduate level. Also a lot of research work now, but certainly at that level. And if we can have this group of skilled people, and if the global economy remains open, production in India of many of the simpler manufactured products would just be cheaper than it would be anywhere else, or in many other places. China would, the fact that they're seeing a demographic transition would mean that they would go into higher value-added manufacturing. They would presumably vacate some of the lower value-added manufacturing, and India would be in a position to occupy those markets. Now, all of that, of course, assumes that the global economy will actually remain open, which I mean, we have to assume that that will be the case. So the big change, another thing about the Indian case is that, you know, we're not running a strategy which is based exclusively or even heavily on export penetration. I mean, we're running a strategy which is heavily domestic demand oriented. To maintain a reasonable growth rate in a domestic demand oriented strategy does require a highly skilled population. Because these same people would be getting jobs in a domestic demand oriented growth strategy. I mean, after all, in India is one of the well accepted things that the growth of manufacturing in India is really not up to scratch. And I would think that that's partly a reflection of inadequate competitiveness, which in my view reflects, on the one hand, very very poor infrastructure, which we are hopefully improving now, and inadequate skills. I think the Indian skills situation was reasonably well geared to a growth rate of 6%. It's just not geared at the moment to growth rates of 9%. Very quickly run into skill shortages. But you know, there's lots and lots of micro evidence which suggests that these skill shortages can be overcome. It's very often a last mile problem. And we have a lot of institutions producing graduates who may not be quite good enough, but a little bit more training and they become pretty good. Everybody talks about the IITs in India because they produce fellows who get jobs abroad. But a lot of the high-tech stuff being done in India is not being done. In fact, the sad thing is that most of the IIT guys then go off and get MBAs and then probably join Morgan Stanley in order to invent derivatives. The technical work is actually being done by fellows coming out of regional engineering colleges. I mean, Isha and I visited Israel a few months ago to witness the launch of the PSLV-5, which put a lot of satellites into space. And after that, we went around the ISRO center talking to a huge number of young people. These are the people who actually build these things. And I was quite struck that none of them was from the IITs. And the ISRO people said, you know, we can't attract the IIT chaps because they go off to Mumbai and so on. But the regional engineering colleges are now producing pretty good people. And you know, they need a little bit more, and you can do that in-house. That's not a reason for not upgrading it further. But there's more quality skills being produced than we think, and the gap that needs to be filled is actually small. That's the bottom line. And that would enable another 2 percentage point growth in manufacturing, which should absorb these people in due course.
I've seen 2 more questions pending. I think that's all we're really going to have time for. So lady there and lady and gentleman up the back. Yeah.
So I'm Nantika Thap. I'm doing postgraduate research in plasma physics in the area of nuclear fusion. If my understanding is reasonably accurate, with increasing GDP, the disparity in income between different classes is increasing as well.
So I missed that. With the increase in GDP?
The disparity in income between the different classes seems to be increasing as well. How can the youth, we as youth, contribute, shape our career and our attitude to contribute to making our economy more balanced?
Okay. Well, first of all, you know, there is an evidence, some evidence of a little bit of increase in inequality. But I don't think it's anything as dramatic as it's sometimes made out. I mean, once again, the one number that is thrown at us, and it does disturb people, is that India has more billionaires than whatever, the United States, and, well, we're third after the US and Russia. And somehow people feel that this is, there's something abnormal in that, and I think that's true. So there's a concentration of a few individuals who seem to be very, very well off. I don't think that the increase in inequality in India is any greater than the increase in inequality in other fast-growing countries in recent times. I think Korea is perhaps an exception. During their period of growth, they didn't have that much increase in inequality. But I think what has happened is that the expectations of people have exploded. And sometimes it shows up in terms of, yes, you got this growth, but why do you have so much malnutrition? Which is a very, in my view, a very legitimate and should be the top priority thing. But that's more like not, the reason is we're not actually doing a good job, in my view, of delivering essential services to the bottom 30 or 40% of the population. Very often people who have found an income level which is much better than what they had before, move into an urban area which happens to be a slum, may have a television, may have even motorized transport, but they don't have any sewerage connection, and they don't have running water. And when you go into this, the reason they don't is that they're an unauthorized colony, and therefore the municipal chaps are prohibited from extending these services to them. because that would be an encouragement for all kinds of illegal residential areas to crop up. Now, at the root of it is a non-functioning land market. I mean, these are people who are earning a reasonable living. They would be able to pay for all these services, but somehow that's not working. And that's not a unique thing in India. It happens in many developing countries. That's not an excuse. But I would say that it's not that inequality is increasing across the board. I think what's happening is there's a concentration of wealth in a few individuals, and modern communication technology projects it. The richest person in India, his house is on the front page of the newspapers. And I mean, some people have a sense that some people are doing incredibly well, and what about me? And that's a fair point. There's a sense that basic services which the state should be delivering, we're not doing a good job. And I think that is what we should be concentrating on. That is a major weakness. And there's a lot of thinking and work going on in India on how to address that issue. But otherwise, the increase in inequality, if you measure it by consumption, distributions, etc., is not all that great. There is some increase, but it's not all that great.
Last question, if we've risked Howard.
I'm Howard Hill from the ANU. Thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. I was going to ask you to try and draw you out a bit on what you think are some of the general lessons for development from the Indian experience you talked about. I mean, the obvious one, I suppose, is the fact that a democratic and highly pluralistic society can achieve major reforms and rapid economic growth. But isn't there something of a paradox in the sense of achieving 8-9% growth in spite of some of the factors you've mentioned? These very large fiscal deficits, these somewhat restrictive labour regulations, serious infrastructure constraints, the fact that India has really missed out compared to East Asia in these global production networks centred in East Asia. Malaysian exports are larger than India's in that area. So, and a lot of veto plays in the policy reform process. So, could I draw you out a bit? I mean, is there a paradox somewhere in the story?
Yeah, well, that was not a brisk question. Nor does it lend itself to a brisk answer, but please try.
No, but it's a very stimulating, it's a comment which I wish I had more time to think about. But let me make one or two responses. First of all, one very important lesson. I mean, this is not only true if you're a democracy, but it's actually true in virtually any place that has a politics. Because you can have a politics which is not democratic. I think it has to be homegrown. Recipes invented from abroad invariably don't work for the simple reason, not that they're wrong. They don't work because if the change is important, it challenges vested interests. And if vested interests are challenged and they can say, this is a lot of imported nonsense, you're not going to win. So it's much better. That's one lesson from India. I recall in 1981 when I was a junior middle official in the finance ministry, and we had just signed the first of our big loan agreements with the IMF. And I had gone to Delhi University to a debate with some academics to defend what we were doing. So I gave some kind of an economic defense, etc. And one of these academics who was criticizing he said, look, I'm not criticizing you for what you're doing. I'm just criticizing you for going to the IMF. You should have done all this and a little bit more, and you wouldn't have needed to go to the IMF. So, that aspect, at least in many of these countries, and today you see that in East Asia. Here we are busily building a new international financial architecture. And most of the East Asian countries, when they talk to you, they say it's all very well, but we're never going back to the IMF, no matter what you do. So that's one lesson. The second lesson, I think we should not underestimate how much economies can adjust. I find too much of the debates that, well, if you do this, then this person will get hurt, and then how do you manage that? Truth of the matter is, the system adjusts. People find other things to do. There's more flexibility in the system than most of these people who try to design reforms give credit for. And very often it's one of the elementary things that, if you're doing a reform and your objective is to make sure that nobody does anything different, then you haven't done the reform. I mean, the whole name of the game should be, let's do this reform, everybody will do things different, 80% of them will win. For the 20 that have a problem, let's do something. And I think somehow if politicians could be convinced that they should take a risk and do things, it would be a lot better.
To express the thanks of us all for this very absorbing, articulate and upbeat presentation, I call on Professor Rakendra Jha, the Executive Director of the Centre.
Thank you very much. Right, thank you all very much for coming to the 2010 Narayanan Oration, the 14th in the series. The text of this oration, along with the message from the President of India, Her Excellency Srimati Pratibha Devi Patil, will soon be printed and copies will be available at ASARC. The lecture will also be available for free download from the ASARC website. At this time, it is my pleasant duty to bring this oration to a close by thanking the people and organizations who have contributed to this year's oration such a success. This oration is named after the now deceased Dr. KR Narayanan, former President of India. Dr. Narayanan inaugurated ASARC in 1994, as Gareth just pointed out, and continued his support to ASARC throughout. It is particularly gratifying that today we have with us the two other dignitaries, the Honorable Gareth Evans and former ANU Vice Chancellor Dean Tedder, who launched ASARC along with Dr. KR Narayanan in April 1994. So we are very fortunate to have this group of people with us today. We also have in the audience His Excellency Major General Jeffrey, former Governor General of Australia, who launched ASARC's collection of the first 10 Narayanan orations in 2007, and his wife, Mrs. Jeffrey, as well as the Indian High Commissioner, Mrs. Sujata Singh, Deputy High Commissioner, Mr. Sharma, and other senior members of the High Commission of India, as well as a number of distinguished guests from the ANU. In addition, we have a very distinguished speaker who has been central to India's recent transformation and who has worked closely, as he himself remarked, with Dr. Narayanan. Also present is his wife, Dr. Mr. Ahluwalia, a leading Indian economist who has contributed an immense amount to both policy making and the scholarly literature. I think to see if he could have seen this gathering today, President Narayanan would have been very pleased. Following from President Narayanan, President APJ Abdul Kalam continued his support for the oration series. We are indeed grateful that the current President of India has continued her support for this lecture, so that the Narayanan oration now forms part of the institutional links between the Australian National University and the Office of the President of India. The High Commissioner of India in Canberra, Her Excellency Mrs. Sujata Singh, and her staff have provided invaluable help in coordinating our contacts with the President's office, for which I am sincerely grateful. We look forward to the continued support of the Indian High Commission to the Narayanan oration and other ASARC activities. Now I would like to thank the organizations and individuals who have made important contributions to this year's oration. When plans for this year's oration were being made, I approached the Australia-India Council. As in the past several years, I expressed my sincere gratitude to AIC for financially supporting this year's lecture as well. In particular, I would like to thank Gary Corbin and other members of the AIC, as well as the Australian High Commission in New Delhi, for their immense help in organizing the details of Mr. Ahluwalia's visit. I thank our Chancellor, Gareth Evans, for chairing this oration and coming all the way from Melbourne to do so. It's it is really very touching that he could be with us today. At ASARC, Stephanie Hancock worked tirelessly and efficiently in organizing the minutest details of Mr. Ahluwalia's visit. I would like to thank her most sincerely for her many efforts. I would also like to thank Mr. Deepak Raj Gupta of the ACT branch of AIBC for his help in advertising this event. Finally, I thank our speaker, Montek Singh Ahluwalia. SRC is delighted and honored to be associated with him. We are sincerely grateful to him for taking the time and trouble to prepare this lecture and to undertake a long journey to be with us today. SRC's list of Narayanan speakers reached like a who's who of important Indian economists and public figures, and Mr. Ahluwalia is a stellar addition to this list. The Narayanan oration arguably now ranks among the very best India lecture series anywhere in the world. Coming to the lecture proper, Montek's speeches have the reputation of enthralling audiences of various backgrounds and even conflicting intellectual persuasions. His oration today has been encyclopedic, profound, and provided a most erudite account of Indian policymaking and prospects for India. The rapt attention and admiration with which this august audience has received this oration are evidence both of the importance of the topic covered and the clarity and profound scholarship of Mr. Ahluwalia's exposition. Thank you all very much.